Well, maybe it's a little bit off topic, but it's sort of related. So my question is to Dani. In the US, a lot of curators are moving away from that label and calling themselves organizers rather than curators. And so I'm wondering, from what I could gather, how is your practice related to that, and also in relation to social practice?
How do you define social practice?
Well, social practice is, it's sort of, I see it as some sort of intervention and engagement with communities, sometimes through technology, in order to figure out something creatively that can apply to their immediate needs. Say somebody going to another country and using GPS systems to map rain patterns that can help farmers.
Yep.
Things like that.
Yeah, I suppose it's a couple. So I position myself as sort of defining curating, as we'll go back to this idea of sort of researching in collective and shared ways with others. And I think, like Jen, sort of every project I work on is completely different. So another project I'm just starting is about sort of land management in the UK, and I think that'll be much more kind of solution solving. And for that, I will draw on kind of much more like participatory action research or kind of other kind of design methodologies that kind of bring communities together in to create some sort of action of their own kind of lives. But sort of for Playboy and more generally, I just am very sort of passionate about kind of opening up the research process and trying to get lots of different people involved. And I suppose that I don't have a sort of name for it yet, I suppose, but as I showed you, that I have a lot of kind of places I draw on. Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay.
There is a really strong history of like kind of the idea of like co-working with people and with communities in participatory design and CSCW, which is a completely different context to art making. But a lot of like what participatory design and community supported collaborative work does is about working democratically with communities, which is definitely a strong thing that is really what I was going to start with, was this nature and this idea of participation and what might it mean to each one of you guys. So for example, when I think about kind of like the method, this idea of participation, I often think as well about like the drawbacks of what these things are. So for example, I think that we can speak about it in three different ways. So obviously participation is inherently political, and secondly then there's the and what I mean by political, I mean the means by which we use it to readdress power or readdress kind of topics of conversation. The second thing that I wanted to talk about was this nature of participation, the idea of who gets to participate and why, what voices are present and what voices are admitted, and how that maybe can be reflected into the actual the outcomes of the project then as well. And then the third thing that is essential when we're talking about participation is the methods, the tools and the techniques that we use to carry out some of these things as well. So at the core of what all three of your practices is this concern with participation, but we can see how it takes on different discourses depending on the perspective. So we have three very kind of distinct perspectives here. We have a curatorial perspective, we have an institutional perspective, and we have an artistic perspective. So I wanted maybe to kind of bring together maybe kind of some of your concerns from your position about like how you might kind of think about through some of those issues that arise due to basically these complicated and complex nature of participation. And maybe you can speak a little bit about like that in the context of maybe some of the projects that you've talked about as well. Sorry, that was a really big question. I have other really small questions.
I'll start. So to answer your question about curators being reframing themselves as organisers, we found the complete opposite at Site Gallery at the moment. So two of our new members of staff, one is a social arts, she's an artist who works with social arts. She's become our engagement curator, and that was her title of choice. And we have a strand of work called the City of Ideas, which looks at infrastructure and public works, and he has come in and he has chosen to be a curator. So it's interesting that you're seeing that move away from that, but I can understand the reasoning behind it. But we are really going for it at the Site Gallery. And last week we hosted the inaugural Social Arts Summit So participation obviously was very much at the forefront of that. And adjacently, I read a lot of, I don't read a lot, but she's got a couple of books. There's a woman who runs a museum in Santa Cruz called Nina K. Simon, and she has the Participatory Museum, and her blog Museums 2.0 is really interesting and inspirational. When thinking about maybe some of the pitfalls of social arts practice, perhaps, some things I think about are ensuring that there is a contract, I guess, between the artist, the institution, and the participant, and everybody knows what they're getting out of it, so the participant doesn't feel they've been used, because that I've seen it. There was also issues around the implication of giving someone a voice, and I'd rather use it's providing a platform rather than giving people a voice. People already have voices. We weren't that's it's dodgy. There's also something that's, I guess, quite tricky and maybe runs counter to what Dani was saying, but from an institutional perspective, we think a lot about, I know a lot of social arts practice is often about the process, but as an institution we do think about what the resulting work is and what that means and how we then archive it as well. I have a friend who's married to a social arts practitioner, and he's an awful person, so I can say this. And he says to his wife, "But you just made a cake today. That's not art." And she's like, "No, but you don't understand why. I worked with this community and we did this." And he's like, "No, you made a cake and you had a good time." And that's not what I'm saying, and that's very he's a terrible person, like I say. But we're interested in what is the result, and how do we show it to its best light, and how do we talk to audiences who weren't part of that process about it if the end result is quite intangible, if that makes any sense.
Does?
I kind of sometimes wonder whether what I do is really participatory, because I think often when people talk about participation, it is about a really long-term, deep kind of participation with an artwork that might be over a long period of time. And I think what I tend to do is the work. We work with a lot of people, and they're contributors to the work, or they're collaborating in the work, or they're part of the process of making the work. But in terms of participation in an audience, I don't think I frame my work in that way anymore. But partly because I think I just don't do that kind of well enough to call it participatory in that way. But I think there's for a while I've been wondering. I teach in a department that has there's a tendency to quite a traditional way of thinking about fine art. So people have a medium they work with, and I think, what's the medium I work with? And it's often it's actually the relationships between people and between things that I'm working with. And there's lots of people that we spend a lot of time with and working on developing the project. So in a sense, it's the creation of the work is participatory, and then there's an audience. There's a way that an audience will act within it, but they, in terms of they're not changing the work in a huge way. They're becoming part of it. But I think there's also a real participating thoroughly in an artwork. There's kind of a big responsibility to it, and often an audience doesn't want to come to something and take on a huge responsibility. It's like, as an artist, you're doing that. You're being paid to do it. That's part of the job. But for an audience, sometimes an audience wants to do something which is has a lighter sense of being part of something. And so certainly things like Running Stitch, the work was you just got given a thing. You didn't have to, and it could wander around, and it happened. It wasn't like there was a really intense, you must pour out your heart in this and give us your soul in order to be part of the work.
But I think that's a really important note. Sorry, just before I go on to Dani, is this like how people participate is a really important thing, like how you structure participation, because that is a really I'm going to actually go on to you first before, because that was going to be my next question. So.
Oh, no, you go.
Well, I just think that's a really important part, because like a lot of what you talked about in your own practice, you talked about this idea of that, like how you engage in an audience is becoming like a really, really crucial part about like how these artworks or how these projects kind of unfold. And like how you structure participation is becoming like almost part of like how like an artwork is made now as well. And it's a really tricky thing to get right. So like sometimes it works really, really well, and then sometimes it like completely falls on its ass, and it's difficult. And I have a lot of notes, but like how there's such a huge amount of work that goes into that just alone. The idea of like, first of all, you come up with these ideas, which is traditionally how artists have really worked, and now you're pushing out into these kind of other ways of working that we don't necessarily have such a long tradition of working within. Like I say that very lightly, but how crucial then. Like, what happens when a network or an audience is not there? Like, how do you respond to those things? Like, has it ever, like, gone disastrously? Sorry, I'm focusing on all the negative things because that's just who I am.
You mean what happens when you make a piece of work and nobody turns up?
Nobody shows up, yeah.
Kind of go out and do more events.
Yeah.
Start going out engaging with more networks. But I think like you were saying, it's part of the thing is to be working with people, actually both of you, in the development of the work. And so by the time we get to, almost the audience is partly the people who've worked on the work, as well as the people who come to it.
Yeah.
So acknowledging that there's probably as many people that contribute to making the work as there are people who come to see it, and they're the same people as well some of the time.
Yeah. I guess maybe that I'm kind of pointing to the fact that now it seems to be that with any kind of creative work or artistic work, that there seems to be an element of audience building that is becoming more and more attached to what these things are. I know, for example, when I often asked to do like run exhibitions or run events, that like somebody in the team, because I work externally, will always come to me and be like, well, what are you going to do about getting people here? And I'm like, oh crap, I don't know. Shit, we'll just have a big party amongst ourselves. Yeah. And that's becoming like, a thing that's beginning to define how people work. Yeah.
I guess I'm going through a similar thing at the moment with Site, and the pressure does come from funding and funders, because they want to see how their money has been spent. So there is always that drive for audiences, returning and new, and it's tricky, especially when you're trying to test new ideas or test new work. And I fully appreciate that. With digital stuff, the stuff that we used to do at Tate, there was one example of a project that we did. We decided to do a narrative that played out over Twitter that was tied to one of our shows, the John Martin show at Tate Britain many years ago, and it was a teen narrative where a young girl got trapped in a John Martin and was tweeting from the painting. And we didn't expect anybody to really get involved with it, especially we didn't run it on the Tate's Twitter, we ran it on a separate one, but the main account signalled people towards it, and I think we had about 30 or 40 people across the world playing it. But that audience was super dedicated and really into it, so we just appreciated the small audience that we got. And we went to a conference a couple of years later and they were like, oh, you were the guys behind the John Martin game. It was amazing. Yeah. So yes, it wasn't wide and it wasn't massive, but it was deep and it was great.
That's important. Yeah, I suppose sort of answering both of those questions, participation is a whole lot of work, and I think what I try to show in my work is that participation happens in lots of different ways at lots of different stages, and actually because there is this whole extra amount of labour that comes in designing ways to facilitate good participation, that actually that's the real tension, is that you need more money for that because you need to pay people for their time, otherwise you do get into these issues. And something that maybe I didn't mention about the Playboy Lab is that actually, not everyone enjoys working in this way. There was definitely, one person that really found it really struggled, with kind of both opening out her practice, not being the main author, and also kind of really wanted everything in a box. She really wanted Playboy defined, and I think it just depends on what kind of practitioner you are and how open you are to kind of reaching out to other people. I think that is a really important point. Another, like a sort of criticism of participation or kind of a cultural democracy in general could be that, whose agenda is it, essentially? Like, I suppose what I was trying to do with the lab and Playboy is really kind of get a group of sort of disparate people together to kind of say, look, I want you to steer what you think is important to go into that exhibition. Like, what do you think is important about these kind of topics that we're talking about, and how can we research them and investigate them together so it's not no one's ideas are neutral, right? And I think there's lots of flaws to that project, but I feel that it has the right spirit, and it's kind of where all culture is going. Because if you look, everyone else is having to open up their spaces and their infrastructures and work in different ways. And I feel like actually that doesn't get done in a wide enough scale with sort of curating. I don't think.
Yeah. I have some kind of like smaller questions, I guess. That one that I kind of actually wanted to ask you was about, you talked a lot about kind of like the different types of platforms that you kind of use to kind of engage when working with different publics. And I was just wondering about kind of like this idea, because you talked a lot about making your own kind of content management systems, and then you talk about like this idea of like plugging into kind of proprietary systems, and also you did as well, and you're talking about your project when working with NASA. And I think that there is kind of like a lot of kind of complexities around some of those things, because on one hand, yes, plug and play is great, but then when those systems become redundant but when they become obsolete, like there are kind of concerns and challenges around kind of like working with those. So how do you kind of resolve those within your own practice then as well? So say if you're working with like something like Vimeo, and then all of a sudden your content gets flagged and you get like booted off the thing, or NASA decides to scramble all their signals, and so you can no longer work in that way. So like how do you resolve those tensions within kind of thinking through about like, creating new types of audiences or new ways of engaging with old systems, or if you know what I mean?
Yeah, I had that question as well, about what do you do with those platforms if you're using other people's platforms. How do you actually critique what all the power relations and what's going on in those places, Or do you or do you not see it?
Oh no, you do, and we have a lot of conversations about, is it right to put, not outside of the children's stuff that I do, which we had to make bespoke platforms for because children, weren't allowed on we knew that they were on Facebook or about to go on Facebook, but we Tate couldn't be seen to be talking to children on Facebook or on Twitter, so we would change up the audience for the platform. So it was a different kind of situation, but I think with my site hat on going forward, if we're working with these platforms, I think that's part of the process. And if they go, they go. And if we have enough lead time, there may be some way we can move some of that content out and put it somewhere else, or it maybe not. Maybe we just have to appreciate the time that we had together, and then let it go. Yeah, it's like there's one platform that I really miss, and it's Vine, and it's the only platform that I think about daily that was brilliant. And the others I don't really care about, but
Site needs to make its own version of Vine, essentially.
Yeah, it was really something, and but it's the way of the nature of the beast, and they come and go, and that's how it is.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Something you mentioned in your talk, Sharna, was your number one was know your audience,
Yeah.
right? And you said how do you? And I wanted to know, how do you know your audience at Site? Like, what kind of ways and methods do you use to find out who your audience are?
Right, so I do a lot of sitting at the front desk.
Okay.
Yeah. So I sit at the front desk, and
School.
because we're such a small team, we all have to do our bit. And I'm not a director who wants to sit in my office and think about things and get down there. And I was there 4 days straight until 10 every night over the opening weekend, just being there and seeing everybody. We do have, lots of institutions have that very dry paper. Your audience breaks down into this, like social seekers and other cheesy titles for people, and we have that. It's useful to a point, but the best thing to do is to be there and to see who's coming through at different points in every day. We spend time. So I'm starting this thing where I sit in the cafe for one day, and so people can come in and talk to me, and I can have like one-to-one relationships with some of our visitors. I know that's very labour intensive and it's not going to be sustainable forever, but it's really interesting for me to do that. I'll have that kind of process as I begin. And we also do, again, audience finder, which is a thing that we have to do. But again, it's a lot of talking and figuring out and I guess pulling it into some kind of shape to find out what they are and who they're like. And we have noticed that now we've reopened after 18 months of closing, our demographic has switched wildly. Before closure it was very student heavy, and now we're seeing lots of over 65s and families with young children. And now like reconfiguring what our offer is to really give them something that they might enjoy. I think it's due to the cafe. We've got a nice cafe, and now that's bringing in a completely new demographic. It generally is.
Yeah. I don't know about you, but I know so many people that are really heavily involved in the sort of the art world, but never go to shows anymore because they just look at them on Instagram, right?
Well, that's sad.
So, but do you count them as your audience?
Do we count? Well, so at Tate we would count visitors to our website as visitors, yes.
Okay.
Would we count them in our visitor numbers? Not necessarily, but we'd absolutely count them and say, we've had X visits, or I would have like 4,500 unique visits to Tate Kids a day, so I'd absolutely want to count that. And within our web team, we talk about things like, dwell time and who spent, what content was the stickiest and what does that mean, and then what was the bounce rate and where did they go after, and all those kinds of things. They were important metrics to have because it showed me, that game really works. This game is trash because no one's playing it, or they play it for 2 seconds and then they've gone. Why? And okay, maybe I won't make another game like that again. Okay, go back. And so at Tate I found that the open-ended play tools worked really well, obviously, because people spend more time thinking about what they're doing. But the more game structures and the ludic structures, they would play once and be like, okay, that was great, fine, thanks, and never come back. So to answer your question, yes, we look at metrics, and yes, I do count the visits, but I don't lump them into visitors, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, totally.
Well, they're a special they're a different type of audience.
Yeah, I just find it really interesting because, like, I think that there should be artworks that no one goes to go see in galleries, because in 10 years' time that could be a really important work and everyone sort of looks back on it. But I feel like if we're kind of forced to make sure that we have a certain number of people come to spaces, we kind of lose that ability just to play around. Do you agree? Yeah.
I think it's really interesting in terms of how you count who's been a participant, because I almost don't want to say this, but the homing work with headphones, when I went back to collect them at the end, I think maybe only 35 people had checked them out. And you spend like a year making a piece of work, and you're like, okay, 35 people. But then we had the start time and end time, so they were spending, I think, 45 minutes on average with the work.
That's
so
amazing.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
And if you just sort of multiply the minutes by the people, you get kind of a reasonable number. But then when you think of all the other events we did where we spoke about the work, or we had people involved in doing all the reading the excerpts for the work and all of those kind of things, we started to go, actually, so there were 35, but then there were this set of people and this set of people and this set of people that all engaged with the work in some way. They might not have had that particular experience of putting the headphones on in the middle of Preston, but and then we've got the videos online that people can engage with. So yeah, I think it's really difficult to know what you call the audience because there's so many different levels of it.
Yeah.
I guess it's a very there's a very neoliberal concern with like how we quantify how an audience engages, and obviously we need a different set of parameters or a different way of looking at these things that actually accurately capture like the value of depth and the value of deep engagement.
But there are loads and loads of types of values.
Of course.
The same way that there is with participation, and I just really would love to see people doing more work around that as kind of art form in itself, you know.
I'm going to open it up to the audience really quickly. Yes.
You said, you just mentioned like in 10 years' time. I was thinking in 100 years' time, what do you think might linger from the work that we've been doing? Especially with digital platforms and technologies becoming obsolete. Is there anything that you particularly will try to save, or is there any, like, what do you think will remain and linger?
That's a great question.
Well, there's always the Wayback Machine on the internet. So there's always ways of seeing like a skeleton or a ghost of the past, I guess. So if I look back at Tate Kids when I launched it, you can still basically get around it, and it's quite sad. Yeah, like oh baby. But they're I don't know if Wayback Machine will be in 100 years, but I'm assuming there will be. And I think about like software emulators. So now you can run all the like SNES games in an Excel spreadsheet, and I wonder if things will continue to be like picked up and being able to be placed into new systems as we go on. But that's really interesting, something I think about a lot. Thank you. I'm like,
I love the fact that you were kind of really lamenting the end of certain projects and
yeah,
websites.
it's
and
like it was funny how emotional I was about it, because I feel like I gave it my best years. I really felt like I was really attached to it, and it was, because when you make things from scratch and you hustle so hard to get it done, and then you pass it on,
and then you cry.
Yeah, it was really like embarrassingly tragic. It's a really embarrassing thing. But yeah, to be so attached to pixels.
Do we have any more questions?
It's a little, maybe more of a comment. I was thinking what you just said now, or about this whole problem of quantifying things. It made me think of, what if it's only meaningful to one or two people? You know, I mean, what's wrong with that, right? So maybe can we, as we try to create community, try to affect funding for these things so that it doesn't have to be quantified. I know it's a real, just a rhetorical question, but I think it's another part of the struggle, right? Because we're trying to work in the system that maybe we can never win, right?
There are ways of doing that. I mean, we're seeing and encouraging people much more to shift to qualitative research, so that we're trying to, the evaluation system won't shift for us, and we're trying to shift it simply by getting people to kind of refuse to promote quantitative research and to move. So there's a big project at Edinburgh University where they're beginning to use, trying to disseminate qual amongst really small arts organisations, and at the moment it still feels like it's their idea of a small arts organisation is like a kind of mid-sized theatre with 20 technical staff and God knows how much casual front of house, but we're trying to encourage them to think much more about what that would mean for 5 people who run a voluntary organisation but are an engine of really exciting practice. So if you just stop playing the game and actually try and work with credible research and researchers, so that you are establishing an evidence base, but on your terms, not by numbers.
Yeah, and just to sort of pick up from Moira, to answer your question, and sort of with that, I suppose that's what we were trying to do with both funk and playboy. And when I sort of say subjective and embodied forms of knowledge, I mean sort of qualitative ways of valuing what we do that kind of sits alongside of societies and different cultures, that we need quantitative data. Like, we need to know about predictions of the world. Like, when it comes down to it, those things kind of do run certain systems and make society, drive society forward. But as an artistic practitioner, sort of what are my roles about creating other forms of value? And that's what I really hope happens in 100 years' time, that we have all of these kind of crazy assemblages of value making, which is what art is about, essentially.
I think it's how practices of making things carry on existing rather than a concern over my own work. I mean, I think in the short term, there's like pieces of work that you're like, I don't want that to go. But and we know that that in 100 years' time, probably the biggest impact or biggest thing that will be left will be like a pile of hard drives in a landfill somewhere. Yeah. And really depressingly, that's I don't address that in anything I do. I mean, it's just that when you asked about 100 years, I was like, geez, like what's the world going to be like in 100 years to pay any attention to any of this?
50 degrees, and we would have dug out all of that and repurposed it to get us where we need to be.
And I think there's, in terms of the critique of the platforms as well, that I got really aware at a point that when you make anything with GPS, there's always people saying, why are you not engaging with the military use of this technology? With the I don't want to do participate in any way because it's tracking people, and I'm not going to buy into that. And I think, for some of the time, I think, well, I'm part of what I'm trying to do is work within those technologies to do things which they're not activist pieces of work about that critique, but that are maybe problematic in some ways, or allow people to think about what the technologies are doing. But I did get really bored of making work with iPhones, and people would turn up and go, "This is really cool. I might have to get an iPhone." And be like, "Oh my God, please don't!" And then realizing that the work was doing that, and so it's really there's some really ambivalent feelings about the technology that we're making work with. But I think, 100 years time, I can't think in 100 years.
I think you should answer that question too, Nora, as you're a curator.
Battery acid, that's what I think. Battery acid will be everywhere. I guess one of the things I would hope for would be that there'd be an increasing amount of interdisciplinariness within all types of knowledges. So the idea, like what we've seen here, is that we've seen that like there's a consideration for multiple forms of knowledge and how they coexist together. And I think that like working in that way is probably, for me, I think it's the most interesting. I also think it's the most necessary when it comes to kind of current discourses around technology and the political and social implications of those things. So that is one thing that I would hope for, at least. I don't know whether it would be there, but I would hope that there would be that. And then the second thing that I would maybe hope for as well, I've forgotten. So, yeah.
Come back in 100 years.
Come back in 100 years. Oh God. But I think that maybe interdisciplinary is that's a really important thing. And then also mixed methods is also a really important way of how we continue to work and to build knowledge bases that actually speak to each other. Like when you think about this idea of like disciplines and domains, like this is only a very new occurrence. So like how science is like separated from the humanities is only a thing that only happened within like the last few like centuries. So this is like so I hope that we would go back to maybe a way of understanding the world from this idea of the merger of art, philosophy and science, and that like we don't maybe separate those things. So because like each one of them has its usefulness in a sense, and I say that very tongue-in-cheekly because we're just after talking about quantitative versus qualitative. But I think it's a really important thing is that different domains bring different perspectives. So how we continue to grow as a society is an important recognition of how those things kind of meet and merge. So, I don't know if we have any more questions. Yeah, I mean, I had another thing, but maybe we don't need to go into that.
Well, we say I think that's 5:30.
Yeah.
It's done brilliantly.
I think everyone has done brilliantly.
Yeah. I want to thank you all as well for all of your presentations. They're all really, really interesting and really insightful. So it's really great to hear about all your perspectives. And I also want to thank both Sarah and the missing Donna for inviting me here as well and having me listen to people. It's great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming.